Continuing with our coverage of Russia and the Ukraine now, there is growing anger in the Republican Party and even in the Democrats over Joe Biden's sanctions-only approach to stopping Vladimir Putin. There's enormous dissatisfaction with how the Biden administration has handled this war. A poll published by the left-leaning outlet The Hill in Washington reported that 62% of voters say Putin wouldn't have invaded if Trump was president. Now, United States Congressman and member of the House Armed Services Committee, Mike Gallagher, joined me earlier to look at Biden's handling of this invasion and what else should have been done to stop this war. Congressman Mike Gallagher, thank you so much for your time today. Have the United States, NATO and Europe underestimated Putin's ambitions and his ruthlessness?
Yes, I think for over a decade now, in a bipartisan fashion, we have underestimated Putin. We've certainly underestimated his ruthlessness. And I think we've also missed an important point, which is to say diplomacy only works when backed by a credible threat of military force. And the fact is we've had years now to put in place defensive weapon systems to make Putin think twice about launching this invasion, which Putin thinks he can be successful in a very quick fashion. Now, the Ukrainians are fighting bravely, but imagine if we had done more to actually put some hard power in Putin's path. Instead, I think we told ourselves a fantasy that simply by doing endless diplomatic outreach to Putin or, firing off sternly worded statements from the Munich Security Conference that we could deter him, or that sanctions alone could deter Putin. Putin clearly was not deterred by the threat of sanctions. So yes, we have underestimated his ruthlessness and his ambition, which I believe goes beyond Ukraine, and it is to fundamentally destabilize the entire NATO alliance.
Well, let's talk about what course could be taken now to stop Putin's ambitions, both in Ukraine and potentially elsewhere. Should the United States and NATO send troops to help Ukraine fight, or just military power?
Well, given how rapidly Russia seems to be advancing on Kyiv, I'm not even sure what's logistically possible in terms of sending troops on the ground. To quote President Zelensky, the fight is here. I don't need a ride. I need ammo. So I think what we need to be focusing on, since our president seems to have ruled out the use of American troops, is how can we get as much ammunition in the hands of the Ukrainians to help them defend themselves and to turn a quick victory for Putin into a long, costly quagmire akin to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, which was initially a brilliant conventional move, turned into an utter disaster that ultimately expedited the downfall of the Soviet Union. So it's Stingers, it's Javelins, and it's anti-tank mines largely. Now, when it comes to our troops, NATO troops and American troops, I support the decision to activate the NATO reserve, send more troops to NATO's Eastern Front countries. What we really need to be talking about is how do we deploy intermediate range missile systems, ground-launched missile systems to NATO's Eastern Front countries. That will make Putin very, very nervous, because if Putin's next step, having consolidated his gains in Ukraine, is to then threaten Poland and the Baltic states, we need to be getting 1, 2, 3 steps ahead of that move right now. Finally, I would say there's more we can be doing to leverage our naval assets in the region to counter Russian aggression, reassert dominance in the Mediterranean Sea, and leverage our relationship with Turkey eventually to reassert our presence in the Black Sea. So we still have options. I believe we can still slow Putin down, even if the window has passed for us to put so-called boots on the ground in Ukraine.
Congressman, in your opinion, are we seeing this invasion unfold in Ukraine because of a deteriorating and weak US leadership, particularly in the wake of the Afghanistan withdrawal?
I think there's a clear connection to the utter fiasco and disaster of our withdrawal in Afghanistan, which was mismanaged. We left thousands of American citizens and tens of thousands of our allies behind enemy lines, and we seem to crumble in the face of opposition from a relatively unsophisticated adversary. And I think Vladimir Putin took note of that. It gave the world a sense that America would not stand by its promises, not stand by its allies. And whenever we project weakness, our enemies seem to get emboldened. Similarly, I fear that the collapse of our position and the ongoing deterioration of America's military deterrent will embolden Xi Jinping in China and make an invasion of Taiwan more likely. So you have that combined with the fact that we simply have not invested what we need to invest in hard power. We're halfway through the fiscal year here in America. We haven't passed a defense budget. We're operating under something called a continuing resolution, which is absolutely devastating for our military. And then the third variable, which I think plays into that, this whole crisis, is the fact that our energy policy has been so utterly misguided. One of the first things the Biden administration did was cancel the Keystone Pipeline. Biden then obviously allowed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline to go forward. We gave a massive geopolitical gift to Putin in terms of our misguided energy policy. And I think that further emboldened him. And he's leveraging the energy dominance he has with respect to Europe in order to advance his goals in this crisis. So I think it's a combination of those three factors. And I do worry about the ongoing deterioration of American military deterrence unless we wake up before it's too late.
Congressman, in your opinion, are we seeing this invasion unfold in Ukraine because of a deteriorating and weak US leadership, particularly in the wake of the Afghanistan withdrawal?
100%. And we should all take note of 3 weeks ago, the 5,000 word document that Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin signed, pledging, endless friendship and no limits to cooperation. And though the CCP has put out statements saying they support sovereignty and territorial integrity, really behind the scenes, Xi Jinping has allowed Putin to go ahead with this invasion and has supported some of his key themes, such that NATO expansion is the cause of this crisis. And I think ultimately what Xi Jinping is going to demand, beyond the massive energy deal they just signed, where there's a 25% increase in Russian gas going to China, is that Putin supports Xi's claims on Taiwan. And again, I think that timeline has gotten expedited because of the weakness that we're projecting on the world stage. I think Xi increasingly sees an opportunity to achieve his fundamental legacy issue, which is the unification by forceful means, if necessary, of Taiwan with the mainland.
And this is exactly why this issue is so important to our global security. And it's not just a case of a war in a far-fetched country. Congressman, you made a very powerful comment this week. You said Putin was willing to write his name into the history books with the blood of innocent people. Now, you have access to classified information in your role as member of the House Armed Services Committee. How expansive do you think Putin's ambitions are beyond Ukraine?
Well, if you look at Putin, and listen, I don't pretend to be a Putin expert, but you don't need access to classified information to understand some of Putin's core aims. His hero is Peter the Great, and it seems like he wants to revive the Russian Empire, and he wants to establish himself as a great man in the history of Russia and reestablish its role. And so Ukraine, I think, is just one part of a broader strategy to reassert dominance over former Soviet satellite countries and completely undermine NATO, and by extension, make himself into a great man. And I think the reason I put it in those terms in the statement you referenced is that I think in the West, particularly in the post-Cold War era, we told ourselves a fantasy that things like this aren't possible because we have an international order and people abide by the rules of the road. And if you run afoul of the rules of the road, you'll get the condemnation of the international community. And President Biden, in his speech 2 days ago, said, "I promise you that Vladimir Putin will be a pariah." Well, it's my contention that a man like Vladimir Putin doesn't care about being an international pariah. He doesn't care if he's condemned by the Davos elite. He doesn't care if he gets disinvited from COP26 and can't hang out with the global climate change elite. He wants power, and he's willing to wield power in brutal fashion to achieve his objectives. And that might surprise people who've been sleeping for the last 2 decades. But throughout most of human history, that's how the international system worked. And it is only the power of the West, America, Australia, all of our free world allies. It is that hard power that allows us to enforce the rules of the road. And until we understand that basic reality, tyrants and dictators like Vladimir Putin are going to continue to shock us and surprise us when they're willing to do very brutal things to achieve their objectives.
Thank you so much for your time.